The next disruptive innovations, I would predict, will be, first of all, unimaginable to us now, which is why they'll be disruptive, but I think will build in some way on the availability of massive amounts of data due to the hyperscaling of the cloud. Most of us don't realize what's going on deep in the computer systems of the world. But even as we speak, even during this minute that I'm speaking, massive amounts of data are shifting away from companies and households and into vast location agnostic computer systems that we talk about as the cloud. Now, as consumers, we enjoy that. We take a picture on our phone, and when we get home, it's on our computer, and we share it with our friends and our loved ones. And that's usually what we think of as disruptive, because we experience that. But the true disruption is that as these data are combined within massive hyperscaling centers, it makes it possible for us to draw inferences and learn from the patterns in those data. So lots of people think about artificial intelligence, for example, and that's just one sort of manifestation of using the information that is deep in the cloud. And that will lead to many other innovations that we cannot imagine today. So I don't know what the disruptive innovations will be, but I do predict that they will be innovations that build on cloud computing and the availability of massive amounts of data in the cloud. Well, you know, I bring this example of Steve Jobs up often when I talk, not to be critical of Steve Jobs by any means. Clearly, he and his leadership team at Apple created an amazing organization, and they gave us innovations that were tremendous. But we often look back in retrospect at Steve Jobs and draw conclusions that are incorrect. We think, for example, that he must have had a vision of the future, but he himself made the argument that when he connected the dots, as he put it, he would always connect the dots looking backwards. The way it works out, as leaders, we have the information that is coming to us based on what we have already seen and done. Then we create the systems that discover what's next. So the great achievement of Steve Jobs was not knowing the future. It was creating a system that would discover that future. And the discoveries he came up with that came out of Apple and the other organizations in that ecosystem were not seen in advance by Steve Jobs, but they did emerge from the systems that he created. And when each one of us as a leader, as a manager at any level of an organization, or even as a young early worker in our career, when each one of us touches others and creates systems, however small, that affect work life, we have an opportunity to create a system that can shape what happens next. And I think that's the inspiration that we should be taking from Steve Jobs. The answer to that question is that, look, when we learn from failures, when there's a quick early failure, and then we adapt to that, usually that change we make in itself is not enough to be a big disruptive innovation. But what that change can do is that it can test a hypothesis which, once we understand it, can be the basis for a very different and very new way of doing business. And I'll give you an example, maybe to help that. The creators of many companies often have an initial idea of what their company will do. Okay, and that initial idea is usually something that they can already imagine when they first create the company, which is why it is what it is. And so when you look at Facebook, when it was first created, it was created to help college students get to know one another. Not really that interesting, if you think about it. I remember back in those days, I had developed a case about Facebook when it was brand new. And it wasn't even interesting to me. I just developed the case because I knew about it and seemed like an interesting social network at college. In fact, my students didn't even like the case. And when Mark Zuckerberg came to my class, I actually got very bad ratings. They said, "This guy is not a businessman." You know, this isn't a business. They weren't even making money. But what was interesting was that the first experiments with Facebook essentially tested a hypothesis. They showed that people, for the first time, that people were willing to reveal honest information about themselves. Now you might say, "Oh, come on, Facebook information isn't that honest." Well, before Facebook, there had been MySpace. People would never use their real name with MySpace. It was all pretend because people were afraid. With Facebook, because it started in college, people felt safer because only their college friends would get the information. And of course, we portray our best self on Facebook, right? All the guys say that they enjoy romantic comedies, even though that's not actually what they watch when they're on their own. They'd rather see an action film. So there's that level of deception, but otherwise it is the person and they are showing their life. And the fact that people were willing to reveal things about their life and then share that with others was actually an interesting hypothesis test. Once that became known, the monetization of Facebook became a possibility. Because of course, that is then something that you can advertise to, you can tailor services around, and we all know about the explosive growth of Facebook. Now, once you go in that direction, you've created a system that can provide services to people far beyond anything you would have imagined. I had no idea when I wrote my first Facebook case way back in 2004 and 2005 that within 10 years I would be in Syria when the Arab Spring was happening through Facebook. I sat with Bashar al-Assad during an interview with him, and he turned to me and said, "America will not overthrow me, but Facebook might." I think that is precisely correct. I think people who see education as job training are making a big mistake. When we are becoming educated, we are investing in the development of our cognitive structure. We're learning basic tools. And those basic tools, because they are fundamental, our ability to think mathematically, our ability to communicate verbally, our ability to engage in complex, integrative, and critical thinking, those abilities are used over and over and over again. When we think in terms of job training, we think about a superficial level of understanding. It would be like saying, I'm going to get ready for my future by learning how to start a car or click on an app, versus by learning the underlying mechanics that create the car's engine, or the underlying systems that make the computer respond when we click it. That superficial level of understanding is extremely valuable for a few months when we graduate. The deeper level of understanding is not immediately paid for by an employer, but gives us the capability of being relevant to an economy that will be innovative and change, and it keeps us relevant for the rest of our lives. So you must see education as a way of developing your mind in the same way that we think of working out and eating well as developing your body. These are deep investments we make in ourselves so that later we have everything that's required to deal with all those developments that we cannot predict today.